would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
On July 16, 1945, at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, spoke those haunting words. Since that moment, the world has teetered on the brink of catastrophe, with nearly 4,000 nuclear weapons kept on hair-trigger alert. But our nation's strategic nuclear deterrent has a critical vulnerability that the Pentagon has concealed from Congress for decades. This weakness in our nuclear delivery systems undermines force readiness and shakes the very foundation of nuclear deterrence to its core. It's time Congress learned the truth. Hey everyone, I'm Matt Ford and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. Almost the entire American public is unaware that literally for decades, unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, have been tampering with, disabling, or retargeting our nation's nuclear weapons, and the government has no power to stop it. Today, we interview the researcher who uncovered these unsettling cases. But first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons on YouTube, leave a comment, and let us know what you think about this episode. You can also find us on X at Good Trouble Show and everywhere else at The Good Trouble Show. You can also find us wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Search for The Good Trouble Show with Matt Ford. And as always, if you would like to chip in to help keep the lights on, you can become a Patreon member of The Good Trouble Show by going to www.patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. Sign up and you can support our work. Today's interview features Mr. Robert Hastings, the author of UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapons Sites. We recorded this interview over the span of 2 months, and I want to note that there were some audio dropouts during our conversation. I encourage everyone to watch this interview in full and then contact your lawmakers in Washington to demand answers and accountability. Our interview with Robert Hastings. Please welcome Robert Hastings. Robert, welcome to the show. So I think it was like around 3 years ago, you were actually the very first researcher I reached out to in this field. You probably were wondering who is this guy reaching out to me. I'm glad you took my call.
Well, thank you for contacting me, and I'm glad we kept the relationship going.
Absolutely. I mean, I honestly think, we owe you, the country owes you a great debt of gratitude. I don't think we would be where we are in this whole conversation, which really has the underpinnings of national security, if it were not for the work you've done with this UAP nuclear connection. But most importantly, I really appreciate your friendship. We speak quite a bit, and your guidance on this whole topic. So let's jump into this. Robert, has the Pentagon been honest with Congress about what is taking place at America's nuclear weapons sites?
Based on what I've heard and seen from members of Congress, no, they have not. I don't know, of course, what's been said in classified settings, but no, I don't have any indication that subject's been addressed, and it certainly could be.
And what exactly has been taking place?
I began interviewing former and retired Air Force personnel in 1973. What they've described to me are, most dramatically, are incidents where UFOs have hovered over nuclear missiles, and the missiles either drop offline, are not launchable, or in some cases are actually temporarily activated, requiring the launch officers to disrupt what seems to be impending launch. Very dramatic incidents.
And is the Pentagon covering this up, in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely, no question. All of my sources say that they were interviewed by what are called OSI agents, Air Force Office of Special Investigation agents, and were warned about severe legal fines, legal penalties, and financial fines if they were to discuss this. Most of the people I've talked to wait a minimum of 20 years before they talk to me.
And you've interviewed over 167 of these former Air Force personnel and officers. Who exactly are they, and do you consider them credible witnesses?
They're absolutely credible. I did, of course, get documentation to corroborate they were who they said they were in the military. A document called a DD-214, which substantiates the type of work they did in the Air Force and the bases that they were at during what time frames. They're launch officers, nuclear missile launch officers, targeting officers, nuclear missile maintenance personnel, and missile security guards, security personnel. And we're talking about incidents at virtually every nuclear missile base in the United States, going back at least to the mid-1960s, early 1960s, actually, when ICBMs first came online.
And I take it all of these Air Force nuclear personnel, they all held top secret security clearances?
I think certainly secret, and I think some of them, yes, have top secret. I can't off the top of my head remember what the designations were, but they all quite clearly had high-level clearances.
You mentioned following these incidents that they had to sign non-disclosure agreements with the Air Force Office of Special Investigation. Are you aware of any retaliation against these former Air Force veterans following, going public with this?
For decades, I could answer no, that none of the people that I talked with were subsequently subjected to punishment of one kind or another. However, in 2015, I learned that one of my sources, who was a missile targeting technician at Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, when he talked to me and allowed me to publish his testimony in my book, I audio tape recording of what he told me. Even though he was retired, he is a member of an Air Force missile veterans or brotherhood. And at one of the meetings, a retired general sidled up to him and said, you're going to pay for what you talked to about Mr. Hastings, with Mr. Hastings. So I won't go into the full story. I'm not going to identify him by name. So in one case, I don't know why he was singled out, but everyone else, to my knowledge, has not had a problem thus far.
And what did these Air Force personnel tell you was occurring at our nuclear weapons sites, and how often was this happening?
The most dramatic instances involved disc-shaped craft, usually hovering over either a launch facility, which is a missile silo, or a launch control facility, which is the underground capsule where the two missile launch officers actually operate a group of 10 missiles called a flight. And collectively, the stories that I consider to be the most alarming, most dramatic, involve these craft hovering over either one of those types of facilities, and then suddenly some number of missiles, either a single missile or multiple missiles, either drop offline, they're electronically impacted in some mysterious manner, and they're not launchable. If a president of the United States had ordered a missile launch against an adversary at that point in time, these particular missiles would not have been launchable. The other incidents, which are fewer in number based on the testimony I've received, but are probably more alarming, are the ones where the object hovers over a missile and the missile actually goes into launch countdown. It's preparing to launch, requiring the officers down in the capsule to flip what's called an inhibit switch that prevents what presumably would be the impending launch of the missile. Very dramatic things.
This sounds like a significant national security threat.
No question. And I know the people at the Pentagon, and I think the intelligence community is fully aware of these issues, in particular the Central Intelligence Agency. I have information to that effect. So they understand the seriousness of the situation. They understand its national security implications. Again, whether any of this has reached congressional members' ears behind the scenes in a classified setting, I wouldn't know, of course. I have yet to see anything in a substantive manner addressing these issues, with the exception of Lou Elizondo, who headed up ATIP, of course. He has referenced the nuclear weapons connection many times and has said in at least 2 podcast interviews that my information is right on target. Everything I presented publicly was factual and documented. And when he was at ATIP, he was made aware of one incident or another.
So when you say these cases are documented, are these documents available to the public?
The ones that I've seen over the years released through the Freedom of Information Act don't directly deal with the missile shutdowns or the activations that I've just described. Instead, what they are primarily are NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, logs describing sightings by the Air Force security personnel at ground level who are reporting sightings of these objects hovering above the missiles. There are also references to military radar tracking the objects in some cases. But I've yet to see a single document released through the FOIA that would address an admission in effect by the military that missiles have been impacted, either deactivated or activated as a result of the presence of one of these objects.
Has anyone had success using the FOIA process, for instance, to try and gain access to the Air Force Office of Special Investigation debriefings of these nuclear personnel?
I attempted that several times in the early 1980s and had the door slammed in my face each and every time. I was told point blank that no such documents existed, even though I had multiple Air Force veterans telling me chapter and verse where it happened, what flight it happened at, what base, what time frame, and so on. And so clearly the OSI is lying. There are those files somewhere. They do exist. They wouldn't throw them away.
So if you wouldn't mind, take us through some of the first cases you investigated.
Well, I can't say the first, going back to 1973, but in the course of time, certainly the most dramatic incident, I think, was conveyed to me by a man named David Schur, a retired Air Force captain. He was a Minuteman nuclear missile launcher. He told me in 2007, again in an audio taped interview, that in 1966, possibly 67, he was at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. He was at what is called Echo Flight, a group of 10 missiles designated Echo. He, of course, was underground in the launch capsule, and he got a frantic call from his security guard at ground level. One of them was called the flight security controller, notifying him that several guards were witnessing a bright, self-illuminated object, silent, flying from missile to missile. And no sooner had he got that information over the phone, suddenly on his launch console, he saw missiles going into activation, into launch mode. And as a guard was reporting a missile being surveyed, let's say E6, I'm making that up, but E6, for example, he noticed on his console that the light indicating that missile was about to launch was illuminated, which would ordinarily indicate that that missile was preparing to launch. There's a procedure involving what's called an inhibit switch, where the launch officers flip an inhibit switch to prevent an unauthorized launch. And he describes, he thought maybe 6 to 8 of his missiles, of his 10 missiles, he had to actually activate that, what seemed to be an impending launch in each of those missiles. Obviously, tremendously dramatic information. If they had not been successful in disrupting those launches, conceivably that could have been World War III.
Hearing that story, I would imagine the launch control officers, when they were relating this to you, this sounds like this had to have been a terrifying experience.
They were utterly terrified. Again, to their knowledge, had those missiles actually been airborne and heading toward the Soviet Union, it's quite conceivable that would have been the beginning of war with the Soviets. So they were just, shaken to their core. Now, Captain Schur told me that when his shift ended and he went back to Minot Air Force Base the following day, the operations officer for his squadron, as he thought he was going to be debriefed, came up to him and said, nothing happened, nothing to discuss, go home. And what Captain Schur speculates is that other crews had arrived back at the base earlier in the day. Everyone was aware of it. All of the launch capsules, 15 in number, were linked by a communication system. So everyone who was a launch officer was aware of what happened. And he suspects that other officers arrived at the base prior to he and his commander arriving. And therefore, the base they'd already engaged in debriefings of the other people, which is why they just told him nothing to say, nothing, go home.
It sounds like the Air Force did not want any of these personnel that had had these experiences, it sounds like they didn't want them to even speak about these cases amongst one another.
They were told point blank not to. And virtually all of the sources that I've talked to, either targeting officers or launch officers, said that when there were these kinds of incidents at various bases in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that they were, usually called in as a unit, as a group, and told, this is, national security, top secret. You do not discuss this, even with your partner, the person that was down in the launch capsule with you. So that's the way the Air Force handled it.
Did any of these launch control officers recount what their debriefing was like with AFOSI, and who was in the room when they were recounting these incidents?
The majority of them, if I recall correctly, described that both the squadron commander and the OSI agent, the commander basically set up the meeting and at some point handed it off to the OSI agent and basically said, tell us, asked the officers to describe what occurred to them, and then, either made them literally usually sign a non-disclosure agreement, but certainly verbally warned them that this was, subject to penalties, severe financial penalties, and even imprisonment if this was ever discussed publicly.
How widespread do you think this was at, for instance, that particular base?
I think looking at the larger picture collectively, my research is catch as catch can. I have to have someone approach me who was in a position to know the facts, or I have to hear through the grapevine that somebody might have information that I can approach them. So there's no way I can quantify how many incidents occurred at how many bases over a period. But collectively, if you look at my research, beginning in the mid-60s, and continuing at least until 2010, which is the last major incident that I investigated. This went on again and again at virtually every nuclear missile base in America.
Tell us about the incident with Captain Robert Salas.
Salas has talked about this publicly for many years now. He actually was at Malmstrom Air Force Base the same time that my father was stationed there, and our family lived there, although I did not know until many years later that he had been involved in this incident. He went public with it in 1994. But he was out at a flight called Oscar, and he again was down in the launch capsule. He got a call from one of his guards at ground level saying there were several strange lights flying around the sky in an erratic manner. Salas recalls just telling the guy, well, if anything unusual happens beyond that, get back to me. Salas said 5 minutes later, the same guy called down to the capsule and was terrified, was frantic, and was describing one of these objects, which was disc-shaped and glowing a reddish-orange color, was hovering over the gate of the launch control facility, which is the building at ground level above the launch control capsule. And this guard told Salas that he had all the guards out there, and they were armed and basically confronting this object that was hovering, just like 40, 50 feet away from the launch control facility. At that point, 10 missiles went offline, were knocked offline. There were lights on his console indicating they were not functional, what were called guidance and control issues, but the missiles were unlaunchable. He also described that they got a report of one of the UFOs hovering at low altitude over one of the launch facilities, so one of the missile silos, and they sent out a two-man, what's called security alert team, to investigate. And apparently, they saw this object quite just not a few feet above the missile silo. At which point, apparently, they turned around and raced back to the launch control facility, scared to death, these two guards. And they felt, if I recall correctly from testimony I read years ago, they were reporting that it seemed like the UFO had actually followed them at some degree, to some extent. And when they were allowed back through the gate into the launch control facility, they just broke down and just were terrified, to the point that one of them at least had to be flown back to the base by helicopter because he was not capable of functioning any longer.
Robert, any idea how long these missiles were down for?
Bob Salas has said that it was roughly 24 hours. Teams had to come out from the base The flight that he was at, Oscar, was about 125 miles away, so they had to get out there and then bring them up one by one. And my understanding, also based on my conversations with one of the targeting officers, Bob Jameson, that it took the better part of 24 hours to get the missiles up. Bob Salas in the 1990s began working with a researcher named Jim Klotz, who filed Freedom of Information requests documents to try to learn what had happened at Malmstrom in March of '67. They did secure a cursory admission from the Air Force about the Echo flight incident on March 16th. It did not acknowledge any UFO involvement in the shutdown of those 10 missiles. It simply said that all missiles went offline and that it was a cause for grave concern. As officially, though, the Air Force has not even acknowledged to this day that the Oscar flight incident that Bob Salas was involved in on March 25th. Analyses that were done at the time indicated that some electronic noise had been injected into each of the 10 missiles. That's what it was described as. Each missile was segregated electronically. They were independently arranged, and yet somehow whatever those aboard the UFO did had affected all 10 missiles by interjecting apparently this, quote, electronic noise into the system. So that's about as much as I know of the situation. Whether Bob has over the years gotten more details beyond that, I'm unaware.
Robert, are there cases of UAPs tampering with nuclear-tipped ICBMs in other countries?
Yes. In the Soviet Union in October of 1982, documents that were secured by journalist George Knapp, I believe in 1993 or 4, he went to Russia and met with several retired Soviet Army personnel. And one of them actually, believe it or not, gave him several hundred pages of still classified documents about UFO activity in the Soviet Union. One of the documents, according to George Knapp, referred to an incident in Soviet Ukraine. I forget the date in October, but October of 1982. What the document indicated was a huge disc-shaped object hovered over this missile base, whereupon down in one of the launch capsules, an unspecified number of ICBMs actually went into launch mode. They weren't deactivated, they were activated. And as far as the launch personnel knew, they were preparing to launch. Now, they were horrified, of course. They thought World War III was about to occur. The document indicates that after some 15 seconds, this anomaly ceased and all of the systems returned to normal. Now, we earlier discussed my conversations with a man named Captain David Shore at Minot Air Force Base in the mid-1960s, in which virtually an identical incident occurred to his missiles, where a number of them were temporarily activated. In his case, he had to activate, as I discussed, what's called an inhibit switch to prevent the launch of the missiles. In the Soviet Union, apparently, everything sort of corrected itself automatically.
So do you think UAP tampering with our nukes, do you feel that this is a show of force on their part, whatever they are?
I have said over the years that one hypothesis would be that they are concerned about mankind's welfare. They understand how precarious things have been in the nuclear age for us, with the potential for massive nuclear war, perhaps less so now than during the Cold War era. But still, the missiles are still there, some thousand or so on either side. And that's just Russia and America, let alone the ones that the Chinese have and other countries have. So one would think that if you were an outside observer, if you did indeed have some concern for, if not humanity, at least our planet system, you would perhaps interject yourself into the situation and either display your presence at these missiles or other nuclear sites, and maybe even sort of drop a heavy hint by interfering with the missiles from time to time. So that's one hypothesis. But I've also said for many years to my lecture audiences, going back to the 1980s, if whoever's flying the UFOs have a presence here on Earth, if they have bases, if they have programs, if they have situations that require long-term presence here, if we have a massive nuclear war, that's going to impact their activities as well as human welfare, human civilization. Their motivations for what we have been observing, according to the missile personnel and other Air Force personnel about UFO activity at missile sites, may have to do something that's as self-serving for their benefit as well as humankind.
Robert, do you know if UAP are tampering with our nuclear forces today?
Because primarily of health reasons, I ceased my investigations around 2012. The last incident that I was aware of was in 2010, which we can discuss in a moment if you wish. I presume that it's still going on. Someone who used to be high level at the Pentagon, who I won't identify here, told me in 2018 that he was aware of a number of missile site incidents involving UFOs between 2013 and 2015. So I have to take his word for it. He's an authoritative source. That's probably the best I can do. The last incident that I did investigate occurred October 23rd and 24th at F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, nuclear missile base. Probably within a day or two, the Atlantic website published a story saying that I believe it was 5 launch control facilities, which the Air Force now calls missile alert facilities. Suddenly, they had communication issues with the base. The base could not communicate with them and vice versa. Those 5 launch control facilities, I'll call them, controlled 50 missiles, 50 missiles. And, you know, the implications are if the President of the United States had ordered a nuclear missile launch against somebody at that point in time, those 50 missiles were going nowhere because the missile officers could not have received their orders. Now, I've subsequently been told, and I can't independently verify this, that a backup airborne system would have allowed those capsules to get their orders. In any case, it was a major disruption. And when I saw this story in the Atlantic and CNN picked it up within probably a few hours, it made international headlines that suddenly this large number of nuclear missiles were unavailable at this one Air Force base. Because I had ongoing contacts with a man named John Mills, who used to be an Air Force Minuteman missile targeting technician. I knew he had contacts at F.E. Warren, and so I got in touch with him and said, you know, I'm a little leery about contacting active duty personnel. I've made it a point not to do that over the years. But if you can, without, you know, making waves or getting anybody in trouble, can you kind of sort of check into this and see what you might learn? And probably 5 days went by, and he sent me an email saying that he had 2 contacts at the base who were missile maintenance technicians, who said that they were a part of several teams that went out to the field to correct the problem, to try to figure out what the issue was. And while these independent teams were out in the field, both the night of October 23rd and the following morning on the 24th, they observed a huge cigar-shaped object maneuvering in the skies above F.E. Warren's missile. I'm quite sure there's a link between the presence of that object and the missiles. The missiles were after the Air Force in that Atlantic website article. The Air Force claimed they held a press conference in response actually to the article. They said that the missiles were only there was only an issue with the communications for 56 minutes, 59 minutes it was. But what my sources told John Mills was that the missiles were intermittently up and down for 26 hours, which I'm sure the Air Force did not want to advertise.
Yeah.
So pretty dramatic stuff. That's probably the last detailed investigation that I conducted into all of this several years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how people cannot think that this is not a national security issue. I mean, it clearly is.
No question. Even I've said this also over the years, and even in a couple of recent interviews, I hope within the next 5 years, if not sooner, the U.S. government is going to acknowledge that these are real craft. They're piloted by non-human entities, And I think that will at least be made public, hopefully within 5 years. But even then, you're not going to hear anyone in Washington get up on a podium and talk about nuclear weapons being shut down by the beings who fly the UFOs or activate the missiles. It's just too unsettling. It's too frightening for the average person. I've been talking about it publicly since 1981. And so, my lecture audiences were in on the secret. The local media all over the country who covered my program, I gave 500 lectures over a 36-year period. They were in on it, but the national media ignored me like the plague. They never covered any of my lectures, any of my comments. And I think that's the strategy that the government will take, even after they acknowledge the UFO reality, let's call it. They're not going to immediately be talking about the nuclear weapons cases.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the mainstream media has just literally been an abject failure in covering the UAP topic. Just it just boggles the mind.
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, this has developed over several decades. I don't know that I could blame a journalist in the 1950s and 60s for being very skeptical about the idea of alien visitors shutting down our missiles. I mean, that was just really beyond the pale. But now, what's come out in the last 10 years, especially even in the last 5 years, there's enough credible data from enough credible sources that more than a handful of mainstream media journalists should have found their courage somewhere and stepped out and began interviewing some of the people that I've interviewed, or doing in-depth interviews with the people who have the inside story. But that's with the exception of a handful of people like Leslie Kean, and I'm going to forget some people, so I apologize to those who I don't name, but Mark von Rennenkamp nowadays, and a guy, I'm drawing a blank here.
I do this all the time.
Yeah, well, I'm 74 now. This is par for the course, so bear with me. But there's a handful of journalists. They know who they are, who buck the trend. They're ahead of the curve, and they've begun taking this seriously. And when history is written, they'll be the pioneers, along with the military people who are coming out. And the other cowardly journalists who think that they're the pinnacle of journalistic coverage in the world, who never touch a story because of their own biases or just fear of being laughed at or whatever. There'll be footnotes. People like Leslie Kean will have books written about them.
Now, I understand Senator Mike Rounds was given a copy of your book, UFOs and Nukes.
An individual named Douglas Johnson in Washington has taken it upon himself over the years to give my book, UFOs and Nukes, to several people in Washington, including Senator Rounds. And the story I got, this would have been April 30th of last year. He approached Senator Rounds and one of his aides, handed him a copy of my book and said, if you're serious about the UAP issue, you really need to read this. This gentleman has interviewed, nearly 200 military veterans going back several decades. They were involved with nuclear weapons incidents. And according to Doug Johnson, the senator said, do you think he would brief us on all this? Now, that was almost a year ago, and I've not heard from anyone. I'm not expecting to hear from anyone, but that's what apparently he said to Doug. And then he handed the book to his aide and said, look into this. That's all I know about the situation, really.
Now, Robert, in addition to your book, UFOs and Nukes, you also published one in 2019 that I think some of our folks at home may not be familiar with. You wrote this with Dr. Bob Jacobs, and it's called Confession, Our Hidden Alien Encounters Revealed. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, my whole UFO research career, which goes back at least to 1973, has been devoted to the military cases. I'm trying to utilize testimony from military personnel. It's a nuts and bolts approach, a journalistic approach to the subject. I try to emphasize things like radar data, which are empirical data that corroborate anecdotal data, which are testimonies. And that's my approach to that subject. However, in August of 1988, I went on a camping trip. with about 15 people in the mountains near Albuquerque, New Mexico. And long story short, what occurred that night made me convinced beyond any doubt that I, in fact, together with two people, had been abducted by non-human entities. And when it occurred, of course, it was shocking. I never anticipated anything like that occurring in my life. I was aware of the abduction stories, things written by Bud Hopkins and John Mack and others exploring the abduction phenomenon. But the thought of it actually entering my own life was just nothing that I ever considered. But it was clear after this experience that suddenly I was among the category of people called experiencers, and or abductees is another term. And as much as I wish that it hadn't happened, it did. And over the course of the late 80s, all through the 90s, and into at least 2014 rather, I had multiple experiences that could be characterized as abductions by non-human entities. I understood very early on when this occurred that if I were to suddenly go public with this and let people know that I have had these experiences, that my credibility would be shredded in several quarters. And I just decided that I was having some impact, it seemed, in convincing the public and the media about the reality of the nuclear weapons cases. And so I just decided it was a strategic decision on my part to keep secret my personal experiences. However, in 2017, I was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. It was made clear to me that my future was quite uncertain. And I just didn't want to leave the planet without coming clean on this and acknowledging that this was a part of my life. Now, as this all unfolded, it came to my attention Dr. Bob Jacobs, who was the source for the Big Sur UFO incident, which many of your listeners know about, viewers, I should say. And long story short, he confessed to me that he had had abduction experiences. So in 2019, we decided that we would write a book together, get this out in the open. And so we wrote this book, and it describes as best as possible our limited understanding of the situation. But it's real. These experiences are physical. They are face-to-face confrontations with NHI. They're not psychological fantasies. They're not delusions. And so it's part of the story. And if the full story is to be told about the UFO reality, I have to, from my own perspective, incorporate this in all of my other work. Thankfully, as of 2014, nothing has happened, at least as far as I can recall. That last experience involved me on December 31st, 2014, waking up from a deep sleep and sitting up and lifting my head off the pillow and seeing an entity about 4 feet tall standing at the foot of my bed. And I could only see its silhouette from a nightlight shining through the door from a bathroom, but it was clearly a, quote, gray, large, bulbous head. I couldn't see facial features. They were in the dark, but very skinny frame, about 4 feet tall. And I was about to scream because I knew something was about to happen, of course. They were going to take me somewhere and do something, which I have memories of from prior experiences. And what seemed like the next instant, I was laying back on my pillow and bright sunlight was flooding in the window. Several hours had clearly passed. So that happened in late 2014. If anything's happened like that since, I have no memory of it. I encourage, I should add that of all the veterans I've interviewed, 167 that I consider my prime sources, 7 of them are abductees. 7 of these people, including Bob Jacobs and Bob Salas, by the way, let's get that in, have finally come forward and said that they've had abduction experiences. So it's real, and the people who wish this away as some sort of fantasy or delusion, you're fighting a losing battle. At some point in human history, this will be known to be real and part of the situation. Since I did mention Bob Salas, let me say we've already discussed his incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in '67. I knew because he and I were in contact for many years. I knew probably in the mid 90s that he was an abductee, but he finally went public with it in 2013 and said that one night in 1985, he and his wife were laying in bed at their home in California, and suddenly the room rather, filled with a bright blue light, and he was just about to sit up and explore what was going on, and suddenly he was paralyzed and could not move. But he did see small figures enter his room, and they lifted him, levitated him off the bed, and took him through a window. That's one of the descriptions that occurs again and again in these abduction experiences. Somehow these entities can move themselves and humans, the humans they're abducting, through solid objects like closed windows and doors and walls. It's probably a quantum phenomenon. How they do it, we don't know. But Bob knows that he was lifted up off the bed, was levitated out a closed window, was taken aboard a craft, was examined physically, very painfully, and then put back in bed. And the other 6 individuals, veterans that I've interviewed who also are abductees, have similar stories to tell. So, I decided, for reasons that I thought would be detrimental to my credibility if I went public with this back in the late 80s when they started occurring, these incidents, I think the time has come for me to go public with it. So not only did we publish a book in 2019, but in the interviews that I've given recently, I've also addressed this as well.
Well, I appreciate your bravery in talking about this. Hopefully, in the very near future, people won't have that in the back of their minds. It's like, this part of the story is important with nuclear weapons or whatever, but I don't want to really talk about what happened to me personally. Hopefully that will not be a concern in the near future, because as you said, it is part of the entire story, and it's something we all need to confront, not just one portion of the truth, the entirety of the truth.
That's right. And people who say, I'll believe in the military cases, but I'm not going to ever believe in abductions, you're fooling yourselves. I don't care what your educational background is or your intelligence level or what you think you know about things. If you don't accept the reality of these kinds of experiences, you've missed the boat. And the sooner, even privately, even if you never admit it to anyone but yourself, the sooner you investigate these cases and understand that they are physically real, they're part of the overall picture, the sooner you'll have a clearer understanding of the whole phenomenon.
Robert, is there any indication the folks that you've spoken with in the nuclear world that admitted they were abductees, did they indicate, had the abductions been taking place their entire life or only after their nuclear encounter?
It varied, and I would have to actually pull out my notes regarding each and every individual to see which one believed they had childhood experiences. Some did. But some did not. Aside from that, let's go into, if we can, go into another case. Mario Woods is a former Air Force security policeman. He was at Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota in 1977. He was a security person at what was called November Flight, 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles. And he contacted me in 2017 and said, I had this experience, so I wrote it up, and we subsequently paid to have a therapist, a hypnotist, regress Mario. He already had conscious memories of this UFO encounter, but we subjected him to hypnosis, if that's the term. He underwent hypnosis in any case, and what emerged from that was only reinforced his prior memories of the event. But he was back at this November Flight launch control facility. Suddenly alarms went off, and one of the missile sites, I forget the designation, which number it was, I think November 5, suddenly something had impacted the missile. The alarms were going off. And so Mario Woods and his partner rushed out to the site in their crew cab. Upon arriving, Mario said there was a spherical shaped object the size of a Walmart building hovering at very low altitude over this missile site. And they were so shocked, so stunned, they didn't even get to radio that to the base, what they were seeing. Almost instantaneously, they began suffocating. It was like somehow the air had been sucked out of the crew cab, and they were both gasping for air. And shortly after that, Mario described seeing 5 small shadows. He initially described them as, but what under hypnosis were revealed to be small entities moving toward his truck, taking him and his partner out of the truck, taking them aboard the craft, and doing various things to them. And I devote one chapter in the book that Bob Jacobs and I wrote to what I call Veterans Voices. That's the name of the chapter. And Mario and Bob Jacobs and Bob Salas and the other veterans who've had these experiences all describe at length what occurred to them. And Mario's story is a part of that. So now we don't know, what's the relationship between the experiences that these individuals had at the missile sites or other nuclear sites and these other experiences, some of which occurred many years later. What's the connection? Why were they subsequently chosen for abductions and sort of interactions along those lines? Again, some of them seem to have memories of childhood experiences, so maybe they were already, on someone's radar, so to speak. And maybe certain missile sites were selected because people like Mario were working at those sites. Maybe they had an understanding of that somehow. There's a million questions. There's very few answers. But Mario Woods, thankfully, has just sucked it up. He's been subjected to lots of abuse and ridicule, but he sticks by his guns and says, this happened. I don't understand why it happened, but it's part of the picture.
So we know members of Congress watch our show and their staffers. What is your message to them right here, right now?
If they're serious about coming to grips with the UAP subject, they cannot continue ignoring the military testimony from personnel who worked with or guarded our weapons of mass destruction. If you want to talk about military-related UFO incidents, I can't think of anything more dramatic. A UFO flying near an aircraft carrier, fine. That's very intriguing. That's very worthwhile hearing about. Or a pilot chasing a UFO in an aircraft, fine. But when you have repeatedly, according to nearly a couple hundred military personnel, incidents going back several decades where year after year at base after base, saucer-shaped craft are coming in, hovering over our ICBMs, and suddenly the weapons malfunction. If you don't come to grips with that, what's the point? I mean, that is the most dramatic type of military-related incident on record. So we'll see. I'm trying to be optimistic about Congress's ability to deal with this, or even willingness to deal with this. With a few exceptions, a handful of Congress people who seem to be at least nibbling around the edges of this, I don't really see a groundswell of interest. So
well, I certainly hope that changes, perhaps under this new administration. The executive branch will hopefully take this thing seriously and come clean with the American public. Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. So what is next for you? And more importantly, how can the folks at home find your books?
My book, UFOs and Nukes, is at Amazon. And as is my second book, which I don't think we've discussed yet, but I don't mind people contacting me. Certainly Air Force veterans who have stories to tell and are willing to talk to me. My email address is ufohastings@aol.com. And I do get hundreds and hundreds of emails every year, so it sometimes takes me a while to get back to people, but I'll make an effort.
Awesome. Well, Robert, thank you so much. We're looking forward to your next book, and thanks for joining us. Robert Hastings, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Matt.
Folks, if you enjoyed this interview with Robert Hastings, we would appreciate it if you would hit the thumbs up and subscribe button. And if you're interested in learning more about UAP tampering with America's nuclear weapons, check out this interview with former nuclear weapons police officer Mario Woods.